Hello, everyone. I'm Nazleen with the Global Good Fund, and I'll be facilitating today's session. Thank you so much for joining us for our second webinar in our series of crisis management trainings. Our topic of discussion today is managing a virtual team. Carrie, our fierce leader, CEO, and co-founder of Global Good Fund, is going to be our expert panelist today. Just to give you an idea of how the session will run, we expect it to run for about 60 minutes, so until 10. The first 20 to 25 minutes will be focused on Carrie's insights and sharing of best practices, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. Please write your questions in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen, right in the middle, you'll see Q&A. You don't need to wait until we've finished our session, just keep on writing in your questions as they come to mind. And with that, I will kick it off with Carrie. So Carrie, when did the Global Good Fund go virtual, and why did you go virtual in the first place?
Sure. So the Global Good Fund has been a virtual organization for the last 5 years, and there was some pushback originally when we did decide to go virtual. But the reason we went forward is because we wanted to retain talent. As a global organization focused on over 30 countries around the world, including the US, we needed to be able to retain talent of our employees as they serve people all over the world, and our employees were moving. And we wanted to retain talent, so we decided to try it by going virtual. I think the other reality was that we were able to hire people who needed more flexibility in the workplace, and by that I typically am referring to parents, so people who could put in plenty of hours but needed a little bit of flexibility on when those hours would work. So we found that by going virtual, we could not only retain talent, but we could also hire for diversity of people at different stages in their lives.
So let's talk about virtual meetings. What are some of the best practices for hosting a virtual meeting?
Sure. So we have found the first thing is to use video. So we want to make everyone feel like they're in the same meeting, and using video conferencing rather than traditional dial-in phone lines has been really useful. It helps personalize the conversation and keeps the participants engaged. We additionally do provide an audio dial-in option because video conferencing, as we all know, can work well, but we want the ability for people to be able to participate by video first and make it clear that video is the first choice and that audio is a backup. Another practice we use for hosting virtual meetings is to make the rules explicit. So just the way you outlined how this webinar is going to go, we would also tell our employees to please silence your phones, do not check emails or multitask during the video meeting. Again, use video conferencing so we can see each other and build some trust that people are following the ground rules. Before we get started with a virtual meeting, one of the first things we do is spending some time just checking in with each other. We don't go straight to the agenda items. Instead, we say, how are you doing? How was your weekend? And one tactic we've been using is to make sure that everyone in the organization gets a chance to speak. Typically, folks who are the lowest on the totem pole, we ask to go first so that they make sure they talk. We make sure they talk, and also, everyone at every level participates to model the behavior that we're hoping to see in every employee. And then if we have a problem with people participating, we just call on people. We just make sure that we go around the table, quote unquote, and make sure that everyone has a chance to speak before any kind of decision is finalized. And then lastly, in a virtual setting, there are things that can be lost in translation. So we try to summarize after each virtual meeting with typed notes in the form of an email summarizing the content of the virtual meeting.
Great. So beyond meetings, what are the top 3 things that leaders that are running organizations can do to create a productive and inclusive remote culture?
Yeah, good question. So what we found is virtual meetings are one thing, and then the culture, which is happening the rest of the time, is a separate beast. So the first tip I have here is to make sure that employees constantly know what's going on. I think people they have a higher likelihood of making things up if they are not connected in person. And when people don't have information, they tend to fill in the blank. And so the first tip here for creating a strong remote culture is just making sure that team members constantly feel like they know what's going on, communicate what's happening at an organizational level, know what the common objectives are, and communication around those objectives we think is extremely important. So we tend to email more and share more because we are virtual. Second, make sure that deliverables and goals are crystal clear. We want our employees to know that they're going to be okay, especially in a time of crisis, that we're going to be okay. Obviously, you wouldn't say that if it's not the truth, but make sure that we're communicating what our revenue goals are, what the other deliverables are, and make sure that our employees know they're going to be okay. When people are communicating virtually, there's a thought process that can happen that some members will feel like they have less access to information than others. And when we're all at home, our imaginations go wild. So we want to make sure that all information is available to everyone equally. And one way to do that is to communicate clearly about revenue goals and other deliverables. And then lastly, just to reiterate, when running meetings, we really try to make sure people feel included, balance the airtime, and give everyone a chance to be seen and heard as much as is possible in facilitating a virtual meeting.
And what about those teams that have an intergenerational workforce? How does having a virtual culture affect employees of different generations?
So, as I mentioned, Global Good Fund has been virtual for 5 years, and I think we've seen the intergenerational needs more prior to crisis of COVID-19 than we have during COVID-19 because everyone is stuck at home. But I'll say before crisis, what I saw is that our younger employees didn't necessarily want to work from home, whereas employees who have families, let's say, may find it better to work at home because there's less commute time and there's things you can do in the break time to take care of a household. We found that younger employees really wanted to have co-working space where they wouldn't be feeling like they're cut off. They wanted to have a way to feel connected to other human beings during the day, whereas people who had families wanted to be left alone. And so one of the things that we did in a virtual culture, obviously not in crisis mode, but the rest of the time, was to make sure that employees who wanted to work from co-working spaces could, that just because we're a virtual organization doesn't mean you have to work from home. And I think we'll continue to do that post-COVID-19. So it's just something that we've seen as part of being a multi-generational workforce, that people of different generations have different reactions to working from home, and it's preferable to some and really not to others. Make that okay.
So we've talked about internal communications. What advice do you have for people who have client-facing functions? What are some of the best practices?
Sure. So obviously, working via video or phone, we can't wine and dine potential clients, but we can do face-to-face conversations, and we do that through video. And you do the same thing, you practice the same behavior that you would do in a live conversation. So be creative. You can do a lot. The main message here is to do the exact same things you would do face-to-face. So things like, getting dressed for the part, making sure you're not in your pajamas, making sure that the introductions are as formal or as informal as they would be in a face-to-face conversation. Typically, you wouldn't eat during a meeting unless it's hosted over a meal, so you wouldn't be eating in an external-facing meeting via video. These are some of the tactics that we would use in a client-facing conversation. And I think the other main message here is that we don't wait to have important conversations with external figures. So we don't assume in a virtual culture that we're going to wait for a time when we can next get together in person. We go ahead and have the important conversation now.
So just taking that question a little further, when we think about the current crisis, and you just mentioned that one shouldn't wait, what advice would you have to any of our audience members who might be thinking, oh, I have a client that I need to talk to, or I have a new client. How do I start to establish a relationship with that individual? Is this the right time? Is there any advice that you can share?
That's a good question. So don't shy. My advice is to not shy away from tough conversations. And I think this is relevant both for pitches that need to be made externally, as well as conversations with internal colleagues. And so when video meetings is the best that's going to happen in a virtual setting, it's really important to move ahead and have those conversations. So we did hear in a prior webinar that now might not be the best time to pitch for additional funding in the current climate. But if that's what needs to happen for your business, then go ahead and do it virtually and use the same, screen share so everyone's on the same slide at the same time. Use the same principles you would use in in-person communication. For an internal conversation, again, we wouldn't wait to have a difficult or important conversation. For example, if there's a cut that needs to be made, if there are changes that need to be made internally, if there are promotions that need to be made, these are all important conversations that need to be had and are time sensitive. We would go ahead and have those conversations. And of course, it's not as maybe exciting or in some cases meaningful as doing it in person, but you wouldn't want to wait, or we wouldn't want to wait to have that conversation 3 months down the road or 2 months down the road. We want to have a timely conversation when the topic is of import.
Thank you, Carrie. We're now moving on to the Q&A part of our session today, and I encourage you all to just post your questions in the Q&A chat. The first question that we have that's come in is, if you sense that despite your best efforts, you have an employee that is struggling, and again, given the crisis that we're in right now, just not feeling focused, feeling alone, what can you do virtually to support that staff person?
Yeah, so we've been through that before, and I think psychological health in a time of virtual settings and virtual meetings and virtual culture is really important and hard. So I think the one thing that's really lost in a virtual setting is the sort of unplanned water cooler conversation. These are clearly important parts of a workday and have a direct impact on how people connect with each other. When we have someone who's struggling, I tend to pick up the phone and call. Or WhatsApp if it's someone out of the country. So when we've had a tough situation, someone's struggling on the team, first of all, it is noticeable by video. So I think the first thing to do is acknowledge that we see someone who's struggling and not call them out on it, but say, hey, I appreciate this is a tough time. I can notice from the videos that you're struggling a bit. I wanted to express that I'm here for you and wanted to know if I could call and just make a time to talk. Then I follow up with a phone call, and that can be planned or unplanned, but the point is to show that you care and are taking the time out of otherwise operationally focused work to just check in on the person. I think the other main lesson for me has been that I am not personally responsible for everyone's psychological health on the team, but it's important for me to help hold people accountable. And so when we're in a virtual setting, it's easy for people to feel like they're cut off. And so one thing that we can do is recommend other resources for additional support outside of our virtual meetings. And that starts with a phone call.
Do you see this crisis changing the way teams and organizations operate going forward?
I do. I think there's going to be an increased support for flexibility in the workplace, that we now know we can all function virtually. I mean, I even see it for health appointments where prior to today, we would have struggled to get a lot of telehealth appointments available. And now that's the way businesses run during crisis mode. And I think, there are things that are lost in translation virtually, but from a convenience factor, there are a lot of ways to facilitate business that's really conducive to a virtual setting. I think it also shows that we can trust each other in a virtual workplace, that we don't need to be constantly seeing each other in person in order to trust each other. And so I think we will see more online operations, virtual cultures in place. And I think the main message here would be the importance of connecting routinely as a team. So one of the things that Global Good Fund has seen is that it's been really important as a team culture that's virtual for the last 5 years. Every single week, we have an all-staff meeting. And the first several minutes, about half of that meeting, is spent connecting with each other. It's that water cooler conversation that we don't have in a physical environment. We also have a monthly team day where the entire day is dedicated to culture building. And so while I do think we'll see increased virtual workplaces, my concern would be that people feel cut off, employees feel cut off from real human interaction. And I think the way to tackle that is by having routine conversations that are focused solely on culture building and team building as an organization.
Thank you, Carrie. So I guess, the main takeaway is that one should also build in some in-person connections in addition to leveraging what technology allows us to do, and also meeting the needs of your staff where they are, and creating a culture that motivates them, and also doesn't shy away from communicating some difficult conversations that still have to happen and can be delivered in a virtual way. Well, we hope that has, we've been able to share some of the best practices that Global Good Fund has done to date as an organization operating virtually for the last 5 years. And I know for many of you, you have already been incorporating virtual meetings, and maybe now it's just sort of full blown and you kind of have to transition. So it's something that I think everyone is doing. Some are struggling with it, and others are just seeing that this is just a new way of doing business and just a new tool in your arsenal of how you do your work on a daily basis. It looks like we don't have any other questions from our audience, so I'm hoping that the information that we have shared with you today has been useful. In the meantime, if you have any other questions that come to mind that we haven't answered, please feel free to email Carrie or myself, and we'll be happy to share more resources and just answer any other questions that may arise. And with that, I thank you for your time today. I know it's our morning, but wherever you're calling in from, I hope it's a good day, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.